Hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the deputy comment editor at the Telegraph, Annabel Denham, with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So let's take a look at the front pages, shall we? Kicking off with the Eye, which leads with Rishi Sunak's defence spending increase, calling it the UK's biggest hike to military spending in a generation. The Daily Mail reports on the Prime Minister saying the £75 billion boost puts Britain's defence industry on a war footing. The Guardian reporting on Mr Sunak's commitment to supply Ukraine with a minimum of £3 billion annually as part of the increase. The Telegraph also highlights Rishi Sunak's commitment to increase defence spending. And The Times leading with a similar headline about the Prime Minister's moving the nation's defence budget to a war footing. The front of the Metro has the headline, "Let this be the last Channel tragedy," after a 7-year-old girl was among 5 people killed while attempting to reach the UK from France in an overcrowded dinghy. The Express leads with the boost to Britain's defence budget, saying Rishi Sunak will axe 70,000 civil service jobs to help pay for the commitment. The Financial Times leads with the Bank of England's warning that lenders are in the dark over private equity risks. And a photo of Prince Louis taken to mark his 6th birthday is on the front page of the Sun newspaper. And while defence spending is on many of the front pages, as you saw, the front of the Daily Star says Kim Jong-un's favourite imperialist gardener has launched his own war on slugs. Well, that was the jeans story, wasn't it, if you remember? A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head straight to Jenny Kleeman and Annabel Denham. Welcome to both of you. I mean, Annabel, kick off, why don't you? This great announcement in Warsaw, you know, half the cabinet seemed turned up, but not quite. So how significant is this moment, do you think? 75 billion extra in defence spending over the next 6 years and the UK's defence industry now on a war footing.
Yes, that's right. It's an absolutely massive intervention from the Prime Minister. Let's not forget, it's only coming weeks after the spring budget when he insisted that defence spending as a proportion of GDP would rise to 2.5% when economic conditions allow. Well, I'm not sure the Prime Minister himself would have been expecting circumstances to change quite so quickly. However, I think that there has been a dawning realisation among those senior players in the government that the world is becoming an increasingly unsafe place. We had the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps at the start of the year talking about how the peace dividend was over, how we were going to have to commit to spending more on our national security, on ensuring that we can keep Brits safe, as well as supporting our allies in whichever conflicts they find themselves in. The axis of evil is coalescing between Russia, China and Iran. We're seeing a lot of evidence of that. These are countries which want to weaken, or if not weaken, then supplant the West and create a new world order. And we absolutely need to be prepared for that. And Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the chief of the Defence Staff, writing in the Telegraph today, pointed out that, you know, it shows that Britain has lost none of her resolve, and that in all great conflicts, the UK has been aware in advance because we've prevailed because we've been aware in advance of what is at stake. And I think that this is Rishi Sunak really setting out that we could be in a 1930s moment, and we absolutely do need to be prepared.
Yes, and it's being sold as this biggest, you know, boost to military spending in a generation. But for some commentators, we're catching back to where we were. For example, after the end of the Cold War, just under 5%. Tony Blair, out of office, 2.5%. It's gone down with the Tories, and now it's beginning to go up again. So it's where we were, Jenny.
Yes, it's where we were, and certainly not where we were in the Cold War. And, you know, the rhetoric of all of this being very much about we're in this pre-war footing, this axis of authoritarian states that we are up against, you know. In terms of proportion of GDP, our defence spending is nothing like, or is going to be nothing like it was during the Cold War. So much of the money that we used to spend on defence is now going on the NHS. That still needs to be paid for, the NHS. So the question arises, where is this money going to come from? I mean, defence spending, huge sums like this, normally not announced outside of a budget. There have been rumours today or suggestions today that it's going to come from cuts for the civil service.
Which in the Express,
The Express is saying 70,000 jobs will be axed. This is an enormous number of jobs. And if these jobs were jobs that could have gone, surely they would have gone sometime in the previous decade. So it does seem kind of fanciful, but there is absolutely no doubt that we've had successive defence ministers calling for a greater proportion of GDP to go on defence spending. We need money for munitions. We have a recruitment crisis in defence. We also have, procurement budget management issues when you're talking about the nuclear deterrent. There are huge holes in our funding that need to be plugged. It seems that Rishi Sunak has been called upon by successive defence ministers to make good on this commitment that Boris Johnson made in 2022. He's picked this particular occasion of being with Donald Tusk, of being on the edge, it's all very cinematic and talking in front of the troops to make this pledge. He is putting pressure on the Labour Party to step up and say that they're going to do the same. But how it's going to be done really is still very much the question now. Yes, and we see the Secretary-General of NATO there. 2% of GDP is the target. We know the Americans pay more. We know that Donald Trump was very demanding of this when he was in power. We know there's a US election coming up as well, don't we? But let's take a look at the Daily Telegraph. Ben Wallace has been writing for them, the former Defence Secretary. And, earlier today, he said, well, I spoke to Rishi Sunak and, there was something we were going to put in the manifesto before the election. We've decided not to do it. Well, what gets junked for this? Because people want spending on public services, don't they, as well as possibly defence spending? Indeed, polls have consistently shown that if there is fiscal headroom, people would rather that it went towards public spending on public services than towards tax cuts. Perhaps it will be tax cuts that are reduced in the manifesto. Perhaps the Tories will promise to chip away further at national insurance. Certainly that's their intention, rather than bringing in some kind of, perhaps an income tax cut, which of course would be more costly to the Exchequer. We just don't know at this stage. But what we do know is that Penny Mordaunt wrote at the weekend that voters care about defence. I think that there's been an assumption among many politicians that there aren't votes in it, so it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But in fact, people understand that we need to have, we cannot have a hollowed-out military, and that we need to ensure that we have a voice on the international stage, and that having a strong military enables us to achieve that. And people also are aware that the world is becoming a less safe place, that we have this rise of authoritarian countries which are coming together, and it's not something that we can, where we can just kick the can down the road. But I mean, we go back to people want potholes dealt with. They want, schools dealt with. They want the NHS dealt with. These massive backlog for people who want treatment. How much willingness is there to keep funding Ukraine, for example? We've seen the battles in the US Congress that desperately need artillery, long-range weaponry and air defence systems as well, don't they? So how much willingness is there from the UK people to keep funding? I think we're not like the Americans, that there isn't really so much of a debate of should we be spending this money in Ukraine. This is much closer to us. We're aware of the stakes if Ukraine falls to Russian control. And I think at the moment there is a consensus that we need to keep supporting them. And I think a lot of British people are very proud of the fact that we have been quite forthcoming in our support for Ukraine. But the fact is, we know that, for example, sanctions, which used to be a tool in a geopolitical a way of putting geopolitical pressure on countries, really aren't working, because Russia's economy grew greater than ours did last year, had more growth than ours did. And that is because there are countries that don't care about the fact that we've got sanctions. China will still do business with Russia and so on. So we do need to spend money on military things. I mean, for me, I just feel that, given that poll after poll has shown that people aren't necessarily desperate for tax cuts when we all know that the country is falling apart. You talk about potholes, what about, the NHS completely, not being able to rely on the NHS working. And I think the government does us a disservice if they assume that that's what we're waiting for. They can level with us, we can take it, we know that things need to be funded properly.
Yeah, interesting looking at the Daily Mail. Victory for the Mail campaign. The Mail campaign is don't leave Britain defenceless. The Mail is also one of those papers who wants to see tax cuts. So, you know, you take your pick here, don't you? They're through saying there's choices to be made. There's choices now to be made for European nations as well, whether they match this sort of funding.
Well, of course, there are trade-offs to be made. Any government has a finite amount of resources. There's a limited amount that it's going to be able to bring in tax revenue that it can spend on public services. I think when we have the debate about the government spending side of the ledger as opposed to tax cuts, we often frame it in terms of education and NHS and welfare and the really, you know, the big departments that soak up most of the government's spending. But actually, in my view at least, the government is at the moment trying to do far too much with the resources that it has. Its tentacles are spreading into almost every area, every conceivable area.
This is a big, small government issue, isn't it? I mean, do you mind if we move on and don't have that specific debate? Because it's no doubt going to be a long one. But yeah, I get your point you're making. So Rishi Sunak, back to action man status, some might say. You know, it's off the back of the Rwanda bill going through last night. The Metro, of course, focuses on what happened in the Channel just hours after the Lords gave up on their ambitions to add amendments to the government's Rwanda bill. Let this be the last Channel tragedy, they're saying, Jenny.
Yes, I mean, 5 hours after this bill finally went through, 5 people dead, including a 7-year-old girl, 112 migrants packed on board a dinghy. These people died on the dinghy, and 57 people remained on board, said they didn't want to be rescued, and headed towards England. So these are people who aren't deterred by seeing people die on their boats. And the question is, will they be deterred by the idea that they could be one of the 200 or 300 people a year that are sent to Rwanda? Rishi Sunak using the opportunity today to say, you know, this is a reminder of why our plan is so important. But the idea of this being a deterrent, I just don't see the evidence for it. It may have been a deterrent in Australia, very different circumstances of the migrants coming there and the seas that they're crossing. These are migrants that aren't deterred by the risk of death. And you'd think if they'll take their chances coming across the Channel, they would take their chances that they wouldn't be among those 300 people a year sent to Rwanda. And if we had spent this £300 million that we've already spent on Rwanda, which will equate to £600,000 per migrant that is eventually sent, I think, in the first year. If we had put that into, like, treating the smuggling gangs like terrorists and putting that money into intelligence to stop those people from getting near the coast, that would have been a much more effective way of stopping the problem.
And Annabel, your paper picks up on this idea of these migrants continuing their journey. French police permitted the flimsy dinghy crammed with 112 migrants to leave the beach near Boulogne at 6 a.m. yesterday. You know, this idea that the French are still not doing enough to stop the boats actually departing.
No, that's right. And of course, we've paid hundreds of millions of pounds to the French in the hope that they will stop these boats. Now, the authorities there have previously said they won't intercept in case it contravenes international maritime law. However, this simply cannot be allowed to stand. Crossing the Channel in this way is surely a crime. The pilot was endangering the lives of minors. And you have to ask why it was that the French allowed them to continue. As Jenny says, this boat designed for, what, 20, 30 people, had 112 migrants on it. You know, it cannot have come as a great surprise to the French authorities that 5 people died as a consequence of it being allowed to leave their beaches. So, you know, I think there's understandable frustration there. But of course, what this underscores is the complete disregard that these people smugglers have for human life and how every effort must be made to try and smash these gangs that are causing such misery.
Well, plenty more still to come on our programme, including The Guardian reporting that the UN Human Rights Chief says he is horrified by reports of mass graves at 2 of Gaza's largest hospitals. Back with that and other stories in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview. With me tonight, Jenny Kleeman and Annabel Denham. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the Middle East, shall we? The Gaza crisis. First of all, the Daily Telegraph, Annabel. Israel is preparing to evacuate more than 1 million Palestinians from Rafah ahead of this planned ground offensive. I mean, this is serious stuff now.
Yes, this would be a massive evacuation. More than 1 million Palestinians. It will take 2 to 3 weeks for the IDF to achieve this before it launches its anticipated 6-week military operation. Now, of course, the IDF will insist that this is the lengths that they are willing to go to in order to preserve civilian life as much as possible. However, it's very difficult to see how the Rafah invasion isn't going to compound the scale of human catastrophe. As ever in this conflict, it's extremely difficult. Nobody wants to see or hear about thousands of innocent Palestinians losing their lives. But equally, were Israel to lay down its arms, Hamas would regroup, rearm and plan another attack like that seen on October 7th. So, one can understand the position of Israel in wanting to defend itself.
And Rafah, the offensive, of course, comes with great international criticism, not least from the Americans and from Joe Biden, pre the Iran situation. In the meantime, questions and investigations demanded of what has happened at mass graves, specifically at one of the big hospitals in Gaza, Jenny.
Yes, it's Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, and reports from, and this is, of course, the Hamas-controlled parts of the government, of about 310 bodies have been found in the courtyard of this hospital over the past week. And The Guardian here focusing on the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, and his concerns about all of this. There are calls for international investigators to go and assess what's happened. But we know that Israel doesn't even allow aid in, let alone external scrutiny, trying to reckon with what has happened here. There is a prevailing culture of impunity, I would say, within Gaza on both sides.
How has Israel explained this then?
Israel has said that there were dead bodies that they checked to see whether or not they were the hostages that they've been looking for, and then they respectfully reburied them. But this is 310 people. And we know also that hospitals get specific protections under human rights law. So we don't know what happened there, and we're probably not going to find out for a very, very long time. We do need independent observers to go and find out what's happening, because we cannot rely on what Hamas is saying, and we also can't rely on what the IDF is saying either.
OK. Final story, which is Wales, in reverse over 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. They've pointed out there was always going to be a reassessment. But, will there be a great repeal from 20 back to 30, do you think?
I think that's likely. I imagine that they'll keep 20 miles an hour around schools, around hospitals, those sorts of places where it does make sense. But to have a blanket 20-mile-an-hour speed limit was pretty crazy policy to begin with. And as the Welsh Government have now said, on certain routes it hasn't been appropriate. Well, I think that anybody could have anticipated that it wasn't a necessary measure. But it does seem as though Wales has become a bit of a laboratory for some of the wackiest ideas. 4-day weeks in the public sector, they trialled a basic income and so on and so forth. So.
OK. Annabel Denham, Jenny Kleeman, thank you both very much indeed. We will see you for more, obviously, in the 11. All the top stories coming up for you then as well.